Comrades, welcome. You're in the right place. It's Monday night. Let me check my watch. It's 7 o'clock. And we've got a fantastic show for you tonight. Two fantastic speakers tonight who you will be familiar with if you're regular RLTV viewers. I'm sure perhaps otherwise you'll be familiar with them from the movement around the UK. And they're going to be talking on, with a wee bit of help from our usual contributors, a series of issues that have been raised over time. And which again you will no doubt be conversant in. Big questions, the usual questions that RLTV attempts to address. What is revolutionary consciousness? How do Marxists link to and intervene in the material and everyday circumstances of working people's lives? And how might they contribute effectively to local, regional, national campaigns and struggles that, as we know, are ongoing? So those and other issues are going to be addressed over the course of the wee while. And I'm just going to introduce you to Graham Bash, who's going to introduce our first speaker. But I've been asked to caveat Graham's wonderful lexicon of expressions. If at any point of tonight, comrades, he grimaces, I've been told to reassure you that it's not necessarily an editorial comment on his part. He's in some discomfort, I'm sure. Again, if you're a regular viewer, you'll know that Graham is heroically battling illness and is in a wee bit of discomfort tonight. So just to contextualise any future expressions. Graham, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I try not to grimace. My job tonight, I suppose to start with, is to introduce my longest known comrade, Chris Knight. He was the first Marxist, the first Trotskyist I ever came across. And I don't know if this is praise or damnation, but most of what I am today is the responsibility of this man. He combines both academic rigorousness, a professor of social anthropology for many years, and also an activist, and has taught me what I hope I know about the relationship between Marxist theory and practice. And that is what he is due to lead off on tonight. Thank you, Chris.
So, what would Marx have said? Well, I think first he would have been pretty disappointed. 2 centuries, pretty much 2 centuries after the Communist Manifesto, and we still haven't won the revolution. But let's imagine Marx on one of today's picket lines with a megaphone. I think I know what he would not have said. He would not have started explaining to striking nurses, ambulance drivers, and railway workers the Marxist concept of alienation, how wage slavery alienates the worker from his species being. And I'm not sure he would have seen it as that much of a priority to educate the people around him on the picket line into his concept of surplus value and the declining rate of profit. The young Marx, passionate author of the 1848 Communist Manifesto, would have searched for the nearest thing he could find to a barricade. And once on a picket line, he would have concentrated on practical tasks. Join up the struggles, prepare for a general strike, lay siege to Parliament, block the bridges, disband the Metropolitan Police, appeal to the rank and file of the armed services, offer them trade union membership and the right to strike, cancel the coronation, liberate the royal family, take power into your own hands and spread the revolution across Europe and the world. Okay, perhaps not exactly those words, but something along these lines. Last time we debated on this program, Tina stressed the need for workers' education. Well, the whole idea of educating the workers, says Marx in his thesis on Feuerbach, thesis number 3, this whole idea forgets that the educator must himself be educated. And the only possible solution, Marx concludes, is self-education through revolutionary practice. On a scale unmatched for a century or more, as we speak, workers across Britain are being educated into the fundamentals of socialism. Most important of all, they are learning the meaning of a picket line. And for me, the RMT's Mick Lynch has been particularly brilliant here. In mainstream radio and TV interviews beamed across the country, he's been explaining the reasoning behind our movement's basic rule: never cross a picket line. Well, why never cross? And Mick beautifully explains, because it's not good to cheat on your brothers and sisters. And if first-hand experience hasn't yet taught you that, you won't even have the basics. And so you won't have a clue which books to read or which teachers to listen to and which to ignore. And no amount of education is going to fix that. Again, in our last exchange on this program, Tina mentioned the Communist Manifesto. So let me read out these critical lines. I quote, "The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes." So what is happening here in Britain under our very eyes? As we speak, we are in the midst of Britain's greatest proletarian earthquake since the general strike of 1926. Millions are being forced to choose between warmth at home and enough food. Nurses are relying on food banks in order to survive. Rail workers, train drivers, railway inspectors, bus drivers, teachers, college lecturers, doctors, ambulance drivers, driving instructors, passport and border control officers. The list goes on. The Royal College of Nursing organising massive strikes for the first time since its foundation back in 1916. And these workers are striking not just section by section, but increasingly in coordinated ways. And all this coincides with a massive political crisis. Mired in sleaze, corruption, lies, and never-ending scandals, politicians on all sides have lost whatever credibility they once had, not to mention the UK's largest police force happy to harbour murderers, rapists, and wife-beaters, the most dysfunctional family in Britain in meltdown as we await the coronation of Charles III, courtesy of Brexit, the prospect of a united Ireland, conflict with Scotland, and the potential breakup of the United Kingdom. All this suggests the initial stages of an economic and political tsunami, which could well culminate in a full-scale constitutional crisis. Maybe not a general strike, but if there was a general strike, it would of course pose the question of power. There'd be a temporary period of dual power if this did reach the point of a general strike. Maybe unlikely, but we have to bear that in mind. And then, of course, on a global level, we have a pandemic unprecedented since the Black Death, people dying for lack of healthcare in just about every country in the world, an increasingly terrifying war in Europe. And as if that wasn't enough, the world's scientists sounding alarm bells as the planet begins to catch fire. So I have so far stressed the importance of the picket line and the primacy of practice. So what exactly is it that needs to be added to this basic class consciousness? And for me, essentially, is just one thing: science. Here's Engels. The more ruthlessly and disinterestedly science proceeds, the more it finds itself in harmony with the interest and aspiration of the workers. Take the Earth as seen from the moon. I imagine everyone here can remember that stunning photo, Earthrise. Look at our Earth as a scientist would. No sign of barbed wire fences, customs posts, frontiers, flags, immigration detention centres. And now turn to politics, to people like Keir Starmer, who talk about Britain first or representing the nation, instructing Labour Party members like myself to wear a suit when speaking in public and make sure I'm standing before a Union Jack. Such pitiful figures are at odds with what an astronomist can see, at odds with science in general, and of course at odds with climate science in particular. Science, said Trotsky, is knowledge which endows us with power. Of course, the critical word there is us. Do we mean all of us humans or just some of us? And of course, it's true that if knowledge empowers us, meaning, I don't know, the property classes or white people or whatever it is, or men at the expense of women, then of course it's ideology. Science is knowledge which endows us with power, full stop, the whole of humanity. And that's why Marx felt it necessary to rely as his constituency on the one class which had the interests of humanity at heart, which was not even a class really, it was a dissolution of all classes. And Marx's project was to be a scientist. As a scientist myself, I have spent my life trying to join up the dots, attempting to provide an updated version of the dialectics of nature, so that when the time came, when an empowered working class felt the need for revolutionary science, it would be readily available instead of hidden away as obscure journal articles on library shelves, gathering dust. Marx didn't write Das Kapital so that he could use it for teaching purposes. He didn't think of it as useful material for educating the working class. He wrote it to help trigger a scientific revolution across society as a whole, an essential component of any truly emancipatory communist revolution. I'm not sure how long it is, but if I've got a minute left, Graham's just made me read this book, or at least a critical chapter here, Leninism under Lenin. And it's just so often imagined that Lenin wanted to kind of teach the working class the kind of consciousness it would need. And what this book by Marcel Liebman points out is in the critical period from February to October 1917, the relationship between teacher and taught, in other words, between party and class, was actually reversed. And again, I mean, for one thing, as Liebman points out, Lenin doesn't even mention the word party. And there must be a reason for that. And perhaps more importantly, again and again, Lenin kept urging his comrades, who were pretty wobbly to say the least, people like Stalin and Zinoviev and so forth. He was constantly urging them, listen to the working class, listen to the working class vanguard. And it was the working class themselves and of course the soldiers in mutiny against the war. It was these workers who taught the leading Bolsheviks to take the power. So the whole question of teaching, of education and so forth needs to be completely rethought. The current conceptions of what Marxism is all about are not just slightly wrong in my view, they are pretty much upside down.
Thank you, Chris. And I think now Graham and was going to put one or two questions to you on those points. Thanks, Chris.
I thought it was Graham and Jackie as well, I think. Well, I suppose my first question, Chris, is that a lot of us here have been brought up on those traditions of Lenin, which are many and varied depending on the period we're in. What do you say about the Lenin of, say, 1903, what is to be done? This kind of almost this implication that we have to be professionals, professional Marxists, or bringing in ideas from outside the movement. Now, that is a distortion of Lenin, but there's something in that. I was just wondering how you think we should see that in relation to the Lenin of 1917, and what reference does that, what does that mean for us today in our today's struggles?
Well, I mean, one or two things. I mean, Lenin, to put it mildly, wasn't brilliant at the beginning of the 1905 revolution concerning the Soviets. He was sectarian. He started out by calling them police Soviets. Trotsky was a hell of a lot more quick on the mark to realize the potential of the Soviets but it took a while for Lenin to come round. But more important in what is to be done, it is absolutely true, and of course correct, when Lenin says that the working class can't develop the consciousness it needs to emancipate itself merely from within the confines, the boundaries of the labour movement. But what he said is the class can only gain an awareness of its strength and its potential through interaction with all the different classes in society, with the Tsarism, with the monarchy, with the feudalism, with the capitalists. I mean, it was in interaction, so that the class, by seeing itself in the mirror provided by enemy classes or other classes, such as, for example, the peasantry, it was only in those interactions between classes that the working class could become aware of itself. That is absolutely correct. But when people say that Lenin said consciousness had to come from outside, it was that. What Lenin was not saying that he was going to be the teacher of the working class and explain to the working class what their consciousness should be. And the reason why that's completely incompatible with Marxism is because the fundamental idea of Marxism is conditions determine consciousness. So the only way you can change consciousness is by starting with conditions. First of all, the working class has to become aware of its power through action, and only then will it feel the need for forms of consciousness corresponding to its increasing power. You have to start with action. And Lenin was perfectly well aware of that throughout his life.
I've just got one short question, really. And this has actually come from somebody in the chat who's kind of challenging you, saying that this is the highest level of class struggle that sort of we've known really in our times. I mean, I think he would say that perhaps the 80s with the miners' strike was more.
Well, I'd be very sympathetic with that. And my view, in fact, yes. I mean, the 80s, the period of just following that, and right up to the 90s, we had although many of the sectarian groups kept on talking about the downturn, I won't mention their names. Actually, it was a period of intense class struggle. And I mean, who wants to sort of just decide between the miners' strike and what's happening today? All I'll say is today's strikes are involving pretty much everybody in direct strike action. And there's a sort of feeling of a potential for a general strike, which of course we can't just carelessly walk into. It would need preparing because it would raise the question of power. So I was heavily involved, of course, in the miners' strike, as all of us were. I helped set up the Mine Workers Defence Committee, perhaps the hard core of the supporters of the miners. And I'm happy to say it's a difficult I don't know, choice to choose between that period and what's happening now. Obviously, what's happening now has less revolutionary consciousness. There's no question about that. On the level of consciousness, we're nowhere near the level of the miners' strike. I would agree.
Okay, over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Shaki, and thanks for those questions. I'll now introduce you. We have a format. Apologies, comrades. I should maybe have described the format. I see in the chat box. There's some questions about that. So Tina, I'll introduce Tina in a wee moment. Myself and Graham will put some questions to her, and at that point, we will open it out to all the speakers, both the speakers as well as the RLTV editorial team. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tina Werkmann. Once of this parish, it's lovely to see Tina back, a long-time activist and, of course, a journalist. So over to you, Tina.
Hi, comrades. Thanks for inviting me to talk about that. It's very important to me, and I think it should be very important to everybody else. I think Marx and Engels were, of course, activists, but they were also theoreticians. And of course, they took education seriously. They threw themselves into the political struggles of their time, but not as cheerleaders. I would argue they were critical participants who did not subordinate their politics. Why do we look at Marx and Engels today? I think it's really important to remember even why we bother with sessions like this. They played a huge role in firstly explaining how capitalism came into being. It's not a natural progression, everything becomes more democratic and capitalism is something we'll go through. But they explained it was a series of violent struggles, revolutions, protests by those below, and lots of blood flowing. They explained how capitalism works, secondly, how the inbuilt need to make a profit leads to constant expansion and going with it the exploitation of humanity and the planet. It is part and parcel of capitalism as a system. It's not about a bad bankers or something, it's a whole system, and they explained that very well. Crucially, thirdly, they explained how to overcome capitalism and establish a truly human society, communism, through the active and conscious actions of the majority of the working class that needs to make revolution. Now, what they did not say or do, and I think that did come up in the last session with Chris Knight when we were talking about it, and you said it again today, that they were mainly spontaneous activists. I would strongly disagree with that. And you said in December they only wrote a program or maybe two when there was a lull in the struggle, and that's a direct quote. If anybody has the collected works of Marx and Engels on their bookshelf, they know just how much those two wrote. They're 50 volumes of the writings they produced, just of the material that's been produced into English. There's more. They combined their actions with theory, a mutual relationship, not just one way. Otherwise, they certainly wouldn't have written that much. Also, the idea of self-education in the context of them having written that much has to be taken with a pinch of salt. And they certainly did their activism and their writing critically. Many of their writings are deeply critical of other socialists and other socialisms that were popular at the time. In fact, criticizing others on the left is the starting point of many, if not most, of their works, and they have that in common with Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, etc. Let's look at the most famous work, the Communist Manifesto, which was written not during a lull in the struggle, but at the dawn of the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions in Europe. They did get stuck in as activists, as commentators, and as theoreticians. They spent a whole chapter in this very slim book criticizing various so-called socialisms that were in fact reactionary and would never lead to socialism, petty bourgeois socialism, feudal socialism, utopian socialism, etc. We should also remember that the Communist Manifesto's real title is the Manifest, the program of the Communist Party. So, of course, they argued, get involved with the unions, the strikes. And today I would argue they probably would be involved with the Labour Party and would have been expelled by now. They wrote or critiqued various programs of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the French Workers' Party, etc. So they got stuck in with the political parties of the left. But of course, they argued for communists to organize too, not away from the working class, but as communists. As it says in the manifest of the Communist Party. So here, just the last few sentences Chris quoted, so I shall quote another part of the Communist Manifesto. They describe quite rightly, communists get stuck in, but not subordinate themselves. Quote now, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. So the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims every time, no matter what the degree of the development, etc. So now Marx and Engels might have been wrong on this. That is possible. But I think if you call yourself a Marxist, I think you should take that attitude as a starting point. You engage with every progressive movement, of course, but you do so with a critical attitude and you openly argue for the need for revolutionary change. A good analogy with today might be the dispute that Marx and Engels were involved in with a very popular anarchist trend in the First International. Marx and Engels argued at length against the spontaneity of this trend and the refusal to build political parties based on a program for revolution. And Marx eventually argued successfully for their expulsion from the First International. So they had these fights. And I do see similarities with the direct action green movements of today. Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil and Insulate Now They all share the same political program developed by a certain Roger Hallam. He's theorized that you don't need the mass of the working class to support your aims. Just 3.5%, of the population will do. Apparently, history has shown that that's enough to get governments to take action. So, for example, the civil rights movement in the US. And that leads those campaigns to pursue actions that are designed chiefly to create news headlines and chaos sometimes. But walking slowly through Islington, blocking motorways, gluing yourself to certain things that to create headlines, for sure. But it also pisses off a lot of normal working class people who need to get to work, hospital appointment, pick up their kids. We've seen footage of these activists being dragged off, not by the police, but by angry working class people. Marx, on the other hand, emphasized over and over again that socialism and communism can only be achieved through the conscious action of the majority of the working class, the majority of the population now, because the working class is the majority, not 3.5%, but the majority actively, consciously fighting for revolution and communism. It's an entirely different approach. So Marx and Engels, of course, would have engaged with these campaigns, but how? I think they would have argued comradely, openly, but critically, writing and speaking with them, that these campaigns have the wrong approach, that you need to win over the working class and not piss it off. But there is this idea on the left, and I think it also exists here in a Red Line editorial board, that the working class just doesn't quite get it yet. Marxism, revolution, communism isn't for now, it's for later, sometime in the future. I think the working class totally gets it if we explain and outline it properly, not by shouting, we need communism at people, or here's how surplus value works, etc., but by explaining how capitalism works and how we must fight openly to overcome it with a better system. And explaining that makes to me infinitely more sense than telling them to continue to vote Labour without illusions or wait for the unions to build something, anything. We'll probably get into that more in the discussion. But I do think they would have gotten themselves involved, but critically, and not subordinated ourselves politically. And that is, for me, the key point. When somebody like former Labour MP Alan Simpson says he will boycott Red Line TV because he was asked too many critical questions about what I would characterize as his support for local green capitalism, then I would have thought Marx and Engels would think that this is indeed a problem, but perhaps not of the person questioning him, but very much of Alan Simpson's problem, who can't stomach having his ideas and so-called solutions questioned. However, I was alone with that view on the Red Line editorial board, which is why I had to leave the show. I think Marx and Engels didn't just critique what the state was doing. They did that too, of course, but they did not hold their fire when it comes to the rest of the left. As I have explained, quite the opposite. They exposed those preaching forms of socialism that often had nothing to do at all with socialism and would often lead to the opposite outcome. And they certainly didn't keep their mouths shut, though of course they were told often enough to do so. So my last point now is we're inviting anybody who is interested in discussing and spreading the ideas of Marx and Marxism in the here and now to attend our new education and discussion series, which, Why Marx, which starts on Thursday. A number of comrades from politically different backgrounds are involved, but we're united in our desire to put Marx center stage on the left, here and now and openly.
Thank you, Tina. So we will open things out in a wee moment, but just together for a wee for 5 minutes or so, Tina. So to raise education, I think all of us would regard political education as an absolutely primary task of the left. And as you say, and Graham's going to join in as well, we should openly declare our politics. We shouldn't be hiding them in any way. How then do we actually practically do that? Because we obviously can't impose our ideas. We need to be sensitized to the mood of the class, to opportunities, to events they've experienced. How do we actually educate in a way that is not elitist, a top-down imposition on them, and will actually meet with some positive response? How do we go about that?
I thought at the beginning, Red Line TV was quite good with that. We critically, examined people with views who are different from ours. If you critique them and you have comradely discussions with them, that's a really good way to do it. What I don't think, for example, Marx and Engels would have done is go to a picket line and say, prepare for the general strike. I think they actually understand, or would have understood, what a general strike really is. A real general strike is not, that's not even on the agenda now. We're so far off that. A real general strike is indefinite. It challenges for power. It would require us, the working class, to be in a position to organize food production, distribution, schooling of children, hospitals, run the states as an alternative to the current state. That's what the real general strike is. So I don't think Marxists should put out slogans that we actually know are wrong, because we would like them to be true. But, there's no general strike on the agenda. So I think they wouldn't have done that. I certainly wouldn't do that, or don't do it when I support workers on strike. Although, of course, it is a demand that comes up. But I think we should explain openly. That would be good, but we're nowhere near. I mean, the role of the unions, I did touch on that in the opening. I think we have to be very critical of the unions and their ability to build anything. If we look at Enough is Enough, entirely undemocratic, absolute minimum demands in this period where there is such a crying out for solutions. The Labour Party is letting us down, left, right, and centre. And what do the unions do? The unions are led by bureaucrats, overpaid bureaucrats, who have no desire in democratizing the unions. That would kind of abolish their very well-paid top-down positions. So we shouldn't wait for these leaders, misleaders, bureaucrats to do something that we know is going to be rubbish. We should appeal to normal workers, the rank and file in the unions, not the union leaders to build some kind of new social democratic lash-up party, which we know is going to be so far removed from what the working class needs today. So we wouldn't be sowing illusions. Marx and Engels, I don't think, would be sowing illusions, and that's our role, I think, to fight against that and be honest.
Graham will come in a wee second. Just a follow-up question to that. Raising consciousness, raising class consciousness in particular, is a key part of political education. And however we may disparage, I'm much more supportive of people like McLinch and Graham than I guess you are. But for many millions of workers inside and outside the trade union movement, never mind inside and outside Unite or the RMT, McLinch is having a concrete consciousness-raising impact on working class people. He is shifting their perception of the world. How do you go about going to a picket line, to use that analogy again? It's a very concrete analogy, and saying we need to do A, B, and C. If at the same time you are disparaging the very leaders that are very effectively, from those workers' point of view, on those picket lines, leading their union and winning material gains for them, how do you effectively win them over from that illusion, as you would describe it, to the kind of general strike that you're describing?
I mean, it sounds really good that you learn your lessons and you learn all your politics on the picket line or, on the streets glued to something or other. I don't think that's true. I think, you do a certain amount of arguing or discussion, you don't piss off workers, on strike. Of course not. You don't go and say, you shouldn't call for general strike. We have to, I think we go with them. I'm going with them to them with leaflets advertising our new series, come along to discuss Marx and what Engels had to say. And McLinch and these comrades, McLinch in particular, of course, he's giving hope, but that goes a certain way, doesn't it? I mean, McLinch is also seems to be a fan of Keir Starmer, so we shouldn't, exaggerate how radical he is or what alternative he offers. He doesn't offer a political alternative at all. He stays very much within the realms of the Labour Party. So it is a very limited arena of the struggle. It's an important arena of the struggle, the unions and the Labour Party is as well. But as communists, as Marxists, I think we should go there and say, fantastic, you're out, but it needs something more than that. And that self-education goes to a certain degree. I mean, goes to a certain point, and then you need something else as well. And you need to discuss with other comrades, what is the alternative? What actually is socialism? I think there's a lot of confusion on the left about what socialism is. Some people think Jeremy Corbyn could have introduced socialism. Absolutely crazy if he even be allowed to become prime minister. That was never on the agenda, that he was even close to introducing socialism. So we have to have serious discussions. And, you know, the need for an alternative is very simple. It's very clear that we need an alternative, but it is actually very hard to explain what it takes. And it's a huge thing, you know, fighting for communism and socialism. It requires conscious revolution. That's a big thing. And you do have to have education on that, and discussion and debate openly, democratically, etc.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Tina. As you probably know, I've been a communist, a Trotskyist for 54 years, and never, ever in that period, although I was a member of the Labour Party for all but the last year, have I ever hidden my views. And I think that applies to a number of Marxists who have grappled with the contradiction between the objective conditions in which we've fought and the objective necessities of socialist revolution. I was a little disappointed what you said about Red Line, because we've always been open to criticism and debate. And in the very fact that so soon after you've left, that we've invited you on, and that was unanimous, is indicative of that. And just for the record, Alan Simpson never threatened to boycott Red Line. That is actually not true. But my question is this, and it's a very difficult one. What price Marxism outside of the struggle to build the working class resistance? What place has Marxism got, except in a period where the working class is actually feeling and finding its strength? Because one of the questions I posed in, I think it may have been in a different venue, a different forum, perhaps organized by you, where I was talking about the role of my kind of forebears, the great heroes of our movement, Lenin and Trotsky, and asked the question, what if they had somehow been artificially transported into the Britain of the 50s and the 60s? How would they have been any objectively better than those who spoke in their name, such as the revolutionaries who fought against the stream, like Ted Grant, Tony Cliff, Ernest Mandel? And my answer was, there probably wouldn't have been any more successful because of the objective conditions. So it is a question of locating the centrality of practice. And I was struggling to really see the difference between you and Chris. I know you kind of polemicized a bit about it, but most of the time Chris was clapping you. And I wonder whether we're trying to make, and it's quite typical of the left, trying to make some differences of focus, differences of emphasis, which there clearly are, into some chasm between us, which I'm still not convinced is the case.
Tina, can I just ask you to summarise your answer quite quickly, and we'll bring Chris and Jackie back in after that. Thank you.
The objective and the subjective is really important, isn't it? I mean, you need to have an objective, you know, the working class needs to be ready, obviously, for a start, and needs to be prepared to be able to, you know, take power or make a revolution. But I think we can't underestimate the subjective. If you look at Russia, for example, would the Russian Revolution have happened without Lenin? That is a big question, you know, without his leadership, conscious leadership. I know he had, you had input from the working class movement, of course, but without Lenin, would there have been a revolution? Look at Germany, where the conditions were even better, perhaps, where the capitalism was more advanced, the working class was more organized and for longer than in Russia. And yet, no revolution, defeated over and over and over again. Maybe because there was no Lenin, maybe because there was that subjective part was missing. So, you know, you need the objective and the subjective, of course, but it also means, you know, in order to you need to get your politics right. And Lenin didn't always get it right, quite right, I agree. You know, nobody always gets it right. That would be a miracle. But they argued, they developed, they had debates openly, they criticized each other, etc., etc. And you know, this is kind of a side issue, but yeah, I was extremely disappointed when I was told I'm a problem, that there are people who want to boycott Redline TV because I'm a problem and I don't let them carry on and I criticize them too much. That was put to me, you know. I worked out it was Alan Simpson. If it wasn't Alan Simpson, I'd be quite interested to know who else it was. It's obviously not Chris Knight, but you know, who was threatening a boycott, and why is that a problem? Why is that my problem and not the other person's problem who can't have their ideas criticized? I was disappointed with the reaction of comrades. Yes, that they think it's something that should stand like that. That's not how, I don't think that's how Marx and Engels would have organized, and it's certainly not how I'm interested in organizing and letting lefties off the hook, you know, who I believe I have the wrong idea. Quite the opposite. I think we should question ourselves all the time, each other, openly, democratically, and not say he's a sort of friend of the movement, you know, his ideas might be wrong, reading us in the wrong direction, but they're sort of on our side, so we should be nicer on them and should concentrate our fire on more right-wing people. I disagree.
Tina, let's do that, because we have got Chris back and Jackie, and Graham's still with us, myself. Chris, do you want to, Jackie will ask a question in a wee moment. I'm sure I put a point. Chris, do you want to rejoin?
Well, yes, I mean, I've known Tina for absolutely years. We've always got on really well. Tina's one of the few people that kind of seems to understand, unlike most people, you know, the kind of stuff I'm interested in terms of human evolution and all that stuff, and primitive communism and all that. So I was just puzzled that I'd said something which upset Tina so much. And but mainly, maybe I did. Maybe, you know, maybe I'm guilty of taking a particular sentence and slightly exaggerating it. But Tina, you've just done that to me just now. You said that I argued that Marx and Engels were mainly socialist activists. And I said, no such thing. Of course, I wouldn't dream of saying any such thing. It's just that in their theory, which is hugely important, of course, as what they were theoreticians, they're founding the theory of our movement. In their theory, they stressed the primacy of practice. They went, I mean, this whole point of Marxist dialectical materialism is the dialectical bit, which is that opposites combine. But the materialism bit is that conditions determine consciousness, and in order to change consciousness, you have to start by changing conditions. It's as simple as that. So, you know, but honestly, as you were speaking, I just thought you were putting it mostly quite a bit better than I did. But you made some valid criticisms. I completely accept. I mean, you know, on Marx and the Communist Manifesto, I was having I thought of the kind of thought experiment. It's a bit like the Second Coming. Imagine Karl Marx sort of came as our Messiah and was present in the current situation, which of course, if it was anything like 1848, it would be a revolutionary situation. I completely agree with you. In reality, this is not a revolutionary situation for all kinds of reasons. It's a huge crisis, and in reality, a general strike is not really on the cards, although of course it's in the air because the strikes are being coordinated. So I do think I don't know why we're doing it. It's almost as if we have this bitter irony that the left feels weaker than ever before in a time of more direct class struggle engagement in picket lines than any of us are familiar with in our lifetime. Why do we feel weak? But what I do know is that when a lot of us, especially around Labour briefing, we're still sort of crying our eyes out over the terrible defeat we had in 2019. And of course, when we cry our eyes out, and it's very sad, there is a temptation to sort of try scratching each other's eyes out. But Tina, I certainly don't want to do that. I have no intention of carrying on in that way. And I can't understand why, given how Redline TV started as a forum within which we could robustly disagree and yet still remain comrades, I don't quite know why, you know, something I said, and I again, like you, I'm kind of wondering what it must have been, upset you so much. But I would just say, one just thing you said about Roger Hallam stuff. I mean, you can't possibly compare Roger Hallam's ideas about gluing yourself to, you know, to doors and stuff with anything like participation on a picket line, which you did say. You said, oh, we have this sort of immediate direct action. A picket line is fundamentally different from that kind of XR direct action. But even so, you know, I just think we have to be inclusive and comradely when climate activists who are following climate scientists are warning us about the most I mean, just absolutely terrifying thing, which is that that capitalism is actually starting to set fire to the planet. And young people do get desperate, they do get frightened, and they don't, you're quite right, they don't quite know how to handle this situation. And so they stop the traffic and they do these things. But we have to be kind of gentle with them and critical. But I mean, the critical thing is not to allow our differences to obstruct the maximum possible unity in action on the things on which we do agree. So I do hope that this evening's discussion can bring us back a little bit from where we've been in the last 4 or 5 weeks.
Can I stop you there, Chris? Tina, Chris, there's going to be a couple of minutes, as you know, subsequent to this conversation, that you can summarise your points. Jackie, Graham, do you have any questions or points to Chris and Tina?
I just want to say a couple of things, which is I totally relate to that. One thing I remember so much is at the beginning of Red Lion was a saying as a commitment, and it was a wonderful commitment and one that I still stand by, and I think as Red Line we stand by, is that when confrontation, conflict, disagreement came up, we would stay and argue it out. And it's wonderful that that's actually been done in a way tonight. It's very sad. I think that Tina felt that she couldn't stay and do that. And that's really pretty much all I want to say.
Graham, do you?
No. I've said what I had to say, I think. And I hope I managed not to grimace.
No, you didn't. You performed admirably, comrades. One last question from me, comrades, and I'll hand over to Tina first and then Chris to summarise. But the climate crisis, as we know, is the primary issue, because there is no socialism on a dead planet. It's becoming a cliche now. And we do have to engage with those groups that are out there. And yet, I think we would all agree that strategically, tactically, they have been found wanting. Do you find, Tina and Chris, any hope in the fact that Extinction Rebellion, for one, seem to have heard some of those criticisms? And what they seem to be saying now, and actually are pretty explicitly saying, is that they are going to embark on a project to disrupt in power rather than people. Is there any hope that that might open a door for class-based politics and a class-based analysis of how to confront the climate emergency if other groups were to go down a similar road? Chris first. Sorry, Chris first and then Tina.
Well, I mean, yes, I always think there's hope and that people will change. And I don't quite know what to say. I mean, in the sense that XR were hot off the mark, what is it, 4 or 5 years ago, and they performed, in my view, a role which, despite all the criticisms that socialists made of them, the fact was that they were bringing to attention of all sorts of people this centrality of this issue. Many of them being nothing to do with Marxism or socialism, many of them being either scientists themselves, and that's particularly the case now, or influenced by scientists. A lot of it started at my own college, University College London. So the answer to you, Mike, is yes, of course there's hope, and I know that many of those XR and other extinction and other climate activists, they're definitely moving to the left, and I'm definitely open to a message coming from us, as long as we're not sectarianism about them, as long as we welcome them and understand where they're coming from.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And Tina, any hope to be found in that apparent change of tact?
Well, hope dies last. Of course, as a communist, you have to believe in hope and that people change, and that we can convince the majority of the working class that what's required is revolution. But that does require a criticism, a comradely criticism, of course. But the whole approach, I mean, they publish it, and they have an active approach that dismisses the majority of the working class as an active agent in achieving what they want to achieve, which is a form of green socialism, not in the way, I mean, in the sense that Marx and Engels talked about various socialisms, not a working class kind of socialism, but sort of local action. Maybe the government could introduce some green measures after all. I mean, they live on the same planet after all, the capitalists. At some stage, they must realize that they will die as well. And it's possible they introduce measures which probably deeply reactionary, depopulation. They're still peddling the lie on the green left that people are the problem. There are too many people on the planet, and that's part of the problem. And we need to just, maybe not in Britain, but the Green Party until 30 years ago had a program of depopulizing Britain and reducing it down to, I think it was 60 or 30 million people or something. Absolute crazy. This is reactionary green politics, So we have to make sure that, we have to explain capitalism is a system. You can't fiddle around on the edges. I mean, you can, but it's not going to change anything dramatically. Sort of solar panels, electric cars, all of that stuff, all very worthy, but none of it is making a dent in stopping the climate catastrophe. And it's brutal. It's a brutal truth that we have to hammer home. Unless we abolish capitalism, we are fucked. They're either the planet goes down or they're introducing something from above, which is extremely reactionary, anti-democratic, probably banning strikes, etc., etc. So it needs democracy from above, from below, from the majority of the working class people, not 3.5%, but 99%. That's who we have to win over, and we have to be honest about in our program, not say, oh yeah, Extinction Rebellion is bloody brilliant, just tweak it a little bit. It kind of needs quite a different approach. It's brilliant that young people get politicized through this issue, but we have to, as Marxists, I think we have a duty to explain why just, gluing yourself and pissing off working class people is actually the opposite of the kind of approach we need. We need to win them over, people, to revolution, and not piss them off.
Okay, Tina, thanks. Chris began this evening off. So Tina, we're just going to ask you to summarise for a couple of minutes your thoughts on tonight, and then we'll hand directly over to Chris.
Oh, I thought I'd just done that. What else could I say? Well, democracy is important, and I didn't walk out because I think the program isn't Marxist enough. I did enjoy our discussions and debates, especially with Graham. I think they were very fruitful, and I enjoyed them tremendously. It's when I was told I'm a problem for criticizing speakers too much, and that I should be kinder and less critical of comrades on the left, and should focus my fire on people like David Miller, who has a terrible position on Iran, in my view. Who thinks the government-sponsored coup, the protest there. I think when we had him on the program, he did the job himself. That's why I don't think you need to criticize him that much, actually, when he was talking about that. I think we need to be very, yes, comradely, but openly critical with people who I believe, and Marxists believe, probably don't have the right ideas going forward, which includes sort of local green, initiatives that remain firmly within the realms of capitalism. I think as a Marxist, I find myself, I have a duty to criticize it, but I'm told I'm a problem and I have to change that and not criticize people so much. I think that's the opposite of what Marxists should do. So I didn't see a future in Red Line TV, which is a shame. But, I'd urge comrades, doesn't mean we'll never work together again, etc. But, I think we need a very different democratic and open critical approach. And I urge comrades to come along to the Why Marx series, where we have that kind of open approach. But thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tina. And I hope the invitation tonight, as Graham mentioned earlier on, demonstrates the principles you describe of open and comradely exchange, of transparency and openness are being demonstrated tonight. Chris, you have your final 2 minutes, comrade.
Well, just very, very briefly. I mean, I have never heard Greta Thunberg or any of my friends at UCL, scientists, climate scientists, I've never heard them, Tina, say what you say is their sort of main line. You say that their main line is reduce the population, humans are the problem. The main line is that you only need 3.5% of people, you don't need the wider community. I mean, I agree with you about Roger Hallam. I mean, I agree, thoroughly with what you're saying there about this strange theory that 3.5% or something in the past, like with suffragettes, has been sufficient to change the landscape. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right about that. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think a lot of activists that I know, young people who've been involved in the school strikes and stuff, would be quite upset that you just take those ideas from them 30 years ago about depopulation, which of course they're going to be around with various people, but they're just not. They're not the mainstream of any of the climate movements that I'm aware of. So I just don't quite know why you pick on those and then see, you know, sort of tar everyone else in the movement with those hugely reactionary ideas. What you haven't mentioned at all throughout anything you've said is the question of science. And I know it's kind of a bit difficult, I suppose, but when I quoted Engels, the more ruthlessly and disinterestedly science proceeds, the more it finds itself in harmony with the interests and aspirations of the workers. That for me is a just marvelous quote. Science has to be not political. It has to be science. It has to be true to itself. And then autonomous science has to be what guides our politics. So there's going to be a relationship between politics and science, but the science has to come first and inspire the politics, rather than political ideology shaping or changing so-called science. Now, for Marx and Engels, there's no question that science was critical, which is why, of course, their whole approach came to be viewed as scientific socialism. But the science itself has to come first, and climate science is now, in effect, revolutionary, because climate science is, first of all, it's internationalist. It doesn't matter who you are around the world, you know what's happening. And climate science is intrinsically revolutionary because it's perfectly well aware that turbo-capitalism is what's responsible, all the production of carbon dioxide, fossil fuels is what's responsible for this catastrophe. I'll just end up one little sentence, which is just what's critical is for Marxists not to become sort of religious, not to turn into little sects, and not to think of Marxism as anything remotely like a doctrine. It should be science on which we base our revolutionary politics.
Thank you, Chris. A useful way to finish. And comrades, I know there's a lot of people looking to get in the chat, looking to join with the discussion. What I would ask you to do is get in touch via our Facebook page and to join the programmes as they move on fortnight by fortnight. It's an ongoing debate and an ongoing discussion. So thanks to our speakers, to Chris and Tina. We're now going to move on. We've got a packed programme the next 20 minutes, half an hour or so. Comrades, stay with us. And we are going to move into a section, our history and theirs. And I think we're not there.
No, not quite yet, because we've got a few things to do yet. In fact, we had a very interesting comment coming up, which was from a comrade in Hastings, saying that in the nurses' picket line this week, there were members of XR there. So I think what we're beginning to see is actually the truth of it, that the differences between us should actually be very small, and that there will be a coming together of people who want to do some radical change. But while we're talking about Marxism and Marx, just in case any of you might not think that Marx isn't relevant, just have a look at this page from what I call the scoundrel sheet. And in fact, it's called the Daily Mail. Let's have a look at that now, please. Okay, this is it. Can you see it? This is wonderful. And this is really interesting. It kind of links with my trip to Berlin and what's happening generally. You can see it says hard left doctors demanding 30% pay rises use Marxist tactics to secure the leadership of the British Medical Association. I mean, you actually couldn't make this up. I love this idea of you're going into hospital and there they are. They're not saying you up. They're not going to be bandaging you up. They're going to be talking about the means of production. Anyway, there you go. That's Marxism for real there.
So, you know, comrades, next time you go, if you're lucky enough to get an appointment at your GPs, you know, you're not only going to get a diagnosis, but a wee bit of political education in there as well. We're going to have more political education now, Jackie. I think there's a clip at some point. I don't know if comrades are going to line up the clip of Jackie in Berlin, or are we going to speak about the conference?
Well, yeah.
Here we go, Jackie.
What was happening last week is that I was actually speaking at the Rosa Luxemburg conference, which is actually, I think, the biggest gathering of socialist Marxists at the moment. There were 4,000 in the audience, and there's just a clip coming on here of some of the things that I was talking about. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I kind of find it hard to go back to those times because there was so much hope, there was so much excitement, there was so much energy, and we had been working so hard on the left year after year. You know how you do, you know, having meetings and doing all that. And suddenly there were people, just ordinary people, poor people, who were actually coming up to us when we were campaigning. And they, I mean, one thing I remember very much from where I live in a quite poor area of London, 50% people of colour. And I remember at one point speaking to women who were going to go to the election to vote, and they had come home after a night duty carrying heavy bags with children, and there they were, and they were going, and they were saying, no matter how tired we are, we're going to go and vote. And it was that kind of amazing energy. And you can see from that film, that's Glastonbury, that's young people mostly, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands suddenly politicized. It was an extraordinary moment. The right of the Labour Party are like centrists everywhere. I mean, most of them are not interested in any kind of anti-racism. They just use it as a cloak when they feel like it, when it suits them. So in the same way that they're not interested in anti-black racism or anti-Muslim racism or anti-Gypsy racism, they weren't really interested in anti-Jewish racism. I mean, you can know that because under Starmer, more Jews have been expelled from the Labour Party than ever before. It's unprecedented. If you're a Jew in Starmer's Labour Party, you are 6 times more likely to be expelled than if you're a non-Jew. So let's just be frank, this has nothing to do with race. Let's just put that away. So it was that clear that this whole thing has been a coup, a well-organized coup, to lead us to where we are. And where we are now is with somebody who absolutely says he will change basically nothing as to what the Tories do. He'll just be a better bureaucrat. He will just administer their rules better. And in that way, I think what's going to be really exciting is if, and the probability is he will get in, when he gets in, that will be the time to look at what the left is going to do, because that is when real struggle is going to happen.
Brilliant stuff, Jackie. And you spoke about how difficult, and it is difficult to look back and think of that window of opportunity we had, and for all kinds of reasons, and this show's discussed it, we weren't able to seize history at that moment. How did you leave Berlin? What kind of hopes did you leave that wonderful, wonderful city with after that conference?
Well, what we were talking about there was this film that was being premiered in Berlin that is actually also being premiered in London, 9th of February, I think it is, which is The Big Lie. And it was such an incredible kind of almost carousel of emotions, because I think on the left here, we're feeling pretty isolated. And to go to a conference where you're speaking in front of 4,000 or 5,000 people, many of them from different parts of the world, and getting those perspectives, it was absolutely extraordinary. And there were all sorts of conversations going on. For example, the fact that we need to claim technology as ours, that the digital industry is actually the new form of capital. You know, so there were people from Cuba who were talking about that, and I thought that was extremely interesting. But there was also a lot of conversation about what's happening in the Ukraine. And I think for the first time really ever, I was able to speak directly with people who'd gone and fought with the international units on the communist side in Ukraine. And that was, for me, quite challenging and quite stimulating. And the whole conversation there, which then came into the UK, was carried on in the UK about whether Germany should actually supply arms. That was very much being talked about, but of course in a very, very different way over there. And to end it with this extraordinary march, you know, the Rosa Luxemburg marching to where, you know, she's buried, and the really, really remarkable thing to see that the huge majority were young people. And what's happening in Germany, and they don't know why, and it's changed in the last year or so, is that they've seen the growth of young people joining all sorts of socialist parties. And they, like I said, they don't really know why it's happening, but you can see it on the streets that it's happening.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, there is a wee a moment of optimism for us if that's happening in a place like Germany. There's no reason it can't happen in different ways in other parts of the world. One last question. Rosa Luxemburg is someone that figures very prominently in our history. What is it? How is she seen in Berlin and Germany? Is she regarded? I guess she's obviously regarded in very high esteem, but they've framed the conference around her name. Is there a particular reason that she represents something that they wanted to be associated with?
Of course, this is the, you know, this is an annual meeting and an annual march that happens. And I think there's no doubt that certainly on the left, and certainly, you know, in East Germany, she is very, very well regarded. You know, there are streets still named after her. The other thing that really struck me was how different still East and West Germany are. That connection with the Communist Party, with left politics, with all of that went on, is still there very strongly. And that actually as well, the other interesting thing when in terms of raising Rosa Luxemburg, when you see where she's buried, all along on the edge are the tombs of other socialists, many of whom were murdered. And the striking thing when you go and read the inscriptions and the stories is in Germany, how many of them were women? You know, and I kept asking the question, why in Germany were so many women? And I really couldn't quite, nobody seemed to understand or have a reason for that. The only thing I could think of was whether our radical women were going into the suffragette movement at that time or had gone into it or something to do with that. But the presence of women in that movement, just extremely strong.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing those recollections from what looked like an amazing weekend. Comrades, we're going to now move to our next section, our Stop Press section, and I think we have some visuals from comrades Becky and Ronnie. Thank you. Brilliant stuff. Thank you, comrades. And let me just share one or two stories from this week's papers. We've heard a lot, comrades, from various CLPs up and down the country, and now finding its way into the mainstream press that the selection contests are being rigged. The left-wingers are being excluded on the most spurious of grounds. Here's a wee story that probably didn't make the papers down south, but was widely reported up here. This is an old Labour MP, Frank McAveety, who is just been selected for a CLP and nonetheless has a history of really quite extreme sexism, and in a public place as well. This was during a break in backbench committee meetings at Holyrood, and the quotes about this is a 15-year-old girl as being dark and dusky and so on. I won't dwell on them, but the idea that this guy compared to other people is a fit person to be selected does take some comparing to others who have been excluded from the whole process. So there's a, as the recent report, the lawyer's report, put it, there is a hierarchy of racism, but there's a hierarchy of all kinds of prejudices, as Jackie mentioned, from Berlin. They're not serious about racism, sexism, and so on. They're serious about a factional project. The second story is something to recommend to you folks from, of all places, the BBC, a fantastic documentary series on hip-hop and hip-hop culture, but contextualising the emergence of that culture within the social milieu of New York in particular in the late 1970s, something that I would thoroughly recommend, and a reliable narrator in Chuck D. Lastly, folks, again, sticking to the music, this is from today's newspaper. Beyonce making a controversial live return in, of all places, Dubai. We hear an awful lot, of course, from a range of pop stars and celebrities about their green lifestyles, their empathy with the oppressed of the earth. And listen, I like a bit of Beyonce and Jay-Z, but here we have someone playing in Dubai where homosexuality, just to give one example, is a criminal offence, punishable by extremely punitive sentences, and is more than happy to pitch up there and put on a private concert for the great and the good of Dubai. So an interesting and sharp contrast between words and deeds from the newspapers this week. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you. And now we're going to one of the my favourite parts of the programme, which is, of course, our history or theirs. So the focus tonight is actually something which is really close to my heart. It's Martin Luther King Day. And of course, moderates have claimed Martin Luther King as their own, which is really interesting because, of course, when he was killed, he was actually moving more and more towards Malcolm X. And we have to remember that his peaceful resistance was actually much more a kind of resistance that we would see in direct action. It wasn't just people being passive. They were being, if you like, loudly passive. And so what we're going to do now is just glide in and think about how the two compare, the moderate view of anti-racism and Martin Luther King's view of what anti-racism actually is.
In recent years, I've come to see that these are often the people who stand in the way of progress because they are committed only in a lukewarm manner. And every time you move to try to solve the problem, they will respond by saying, you're moving too fast, you ought to cool off, you should put on brakes. And they end up more devoted to order than to justice, and are more devoted to maintaining a sort of negative peace, which is merely the absence of tension, than gaining a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. This is what we're seeing every day in our struggle in the South, that many of the moderates of the white South and many of them mean well, and I shouldn't only say the South, but the moderates all over, stand in the way of progress because they refuse to understand the problem, and they live by the myth of time, failing to realize that time will not solve the problem. And there's a danger that the moderate will live by this myth, believing that if you just leave things alone and not push too much, time will solve the problem.
I'm being targeted by the Labour Party. I'm being targeted to be removed as the MP for Poplar, as the Labour Party candidate in the next general election, because I'm a socialist, because of my politics, because I'm a Muslim woman of Bangladeshi origin. I'm working class, and they don't want us to represent people that are like us in Parliament.
Labour leaders, from Harold Wilson to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, recognised Israel's importance to the community here at home, celebrated its achievements and stood by it in moments of peril. They rightly saw their counterparts in the Israeli Labour Party, from Golda Meir to Chaim Herzog, Abba Eban, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, as comrades in the international struggle for equality, peace and freedom. And this is the bit. Social democrats who made the desert flower, as Wilson put it. Social democrats who made the desert flower. Now that is the most colonialist, paternalist, and frankly racist thing I've heard a British politician say in quite a while. Israel made the desert bloom. Obviously, there was no one there before the first Zionists arrived. The Nakba presumably didn't happen. And Arabs, I presume, can't grow things.
And there you have it. So that's what the moderates think, that somehow that's how you make the desert bloom, that there was nobody there. And that's what they think, that you can kneel down on a nice carpet pile, and that's how you can actually activate anti-racist practice. Well, on our next program, we're actually going to be looking more closely, if you like, at the role that so-called moderates have in actually ensuring that radical change never happens. And we're going to be looking at a number of aspects, not just Israel, not just in the UK, not just Starmer. We're just going to be examining what that whole movement of moderates means to us as radicals. But before we end, and we will end, thank you very much to everybody who's been on the show. We're going to finish off with another rousing tune from comrades on the picket line.